Today I'm going to be getting technical about tea. This video is a little bit different to the normal. I presented to a group of allotment owners earlier this week and they're really keen to move away from the traditional chemical-based approach. So I'll be covering a subject that not too many people tend to cover nowadays, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, this presentation I delivered online remotely because of the COVID restrictions still in place. They're predominantly made up of quite old people, but they're really concerned about their health, and they wanted me to talk to them on the subject of compost tea. Now, a number of them have used compost tea in the past, not necessarily as successfully as they would have liked, so they know a little bit about it already, but there's a whole band of other people that haven't used it. So I kind of had to cover both bases and cover some kind of entry-level type information as well as those kind of slightly more advanced. So it is a bit more of a technical presentation. I hope you like the format. If you do, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. If you don't love it, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as well. Let's get straight into that. Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. It's lovely to be invited to present to you all. I know some of you have a great deal of experience actually with compost tea already, and for others this is a new subject, so I'll try and cater for both. I'm going to get a little bit technical at some points, but I'll try and keep it for the main fairly light and factual. Right, without further ado, let me proceed. So this is an introduction to compost tea. There's a few things I'm going to cover. We're not going to spend too long on this today. The first thing is actually what is compost tea. Then we're going to look at briefly how it's made, the importance of the compost itself within that process, and then why you might actually want to use compost tea. And then for some of you, probably the more important bit is actually how you apply it. I'll summarize it all at the end, and maybe we'll have a Q&A kind of at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, what is compost tea? Well, as you can see here, compost tea is a liquid. It's a biologically active amendment, and you can apply it to all kinds of things, including soil and plant leaves. The fact that it's a liquid means that it's very easy and flexible in terms of what you can do with it. So it makes it a good alternative in places where it might be a little bit more difficult to get compost down. That could be fine turf grass, so golf courses might prefer to use compost tea rather than compost, or it could actually simply be that someone doesn't have enough of their own compost to fulfill application across all the areas they would want to, and in which case they will use some of their compost to make compost tea. The key thing here is it is biologically active. That means that the organisms within it are, or the majority of them, are alive, awake and functioning. With that being said, the functioning bit is the key thing really that everybody's looking to get the benefit from. That functioning interaction with the soil and the plant is where the reported benefits come. If they are inactive, obviously they're not doing anything and there are no immediate benefits. Compost tea is quite simply made by combining compost with water. There are all kinds of different types of compost tea, and if you look back through ancient texts over millennia, there have been all kinds of people writing about various forms of it, steeping manure in a bucket of water for days. Some people talk about nettle teas and other things. Perhaps they're slightly different to this, but the distinction with what we're talking about today is and aerated compost tea. So in addition to the compost and the water, oxygen is added and food sources are added, and those things combined help to multiply all the different organism populations as the solution is brewed. Now, there are some fundamental aspects behind the decision making of what you're brewing and how you're brewing. First and foremost, the compost that you use is super important. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It needs to be a mature and stable compost. So it has to have finished the composting process, the bit where all the organisms break down the organic matter and rebuild it into something that's great for your garden or allotments and vegetable patches. A decomposing compost pile will still be biologically active, but unfortunately it won't contain the types of organisms that we need. They're the ones that move in at the end of that composting process and start to build up as the heap matures. So it does need to be a well matured compost that prays host to a wide range of different organisms such as bacteria and fungi, and ideally that composition will be as biologically diverse as we can get it. Now, when we take that compost and we put it in water, we are putting those organisms into suspension. So we're diluting the compost in the water itself, but we're shaking all of those organisms out of the compost and putting them straight into the water. As they are aerobic organisms, they require oxygen. They need oxygen to be given to them. Obviously, they can only hold their breath for so long before they need to be given an alternative supply of oxygen. This is why we add an air pump and some kind of diffuser to the brewing system. Those diffuse bubbles, those fine bubbles, dissolve into the water as well and are accessible to the bacteria and the fungi and the protozoa that we're multiplying through this process. And as we feed them, there are different types of foods that we can provide to them. The main two tend to be sugars and humics or humic acids. The sugars tend to satisfy the bacteria, the humics satisfy the fungi. As we feed them, they start to grow and multiply. As they multiply, they require more oxygen, or the growing population obviously consumes more oxygen, so we need to provide a continuous supply of oxygen throughout the whole process of compost tea making, a continuous supply to account for that increasing biological oxygen demand. And if you leave it too long, they can consume all of the food and the population starts to crash, or you start to lose the diversity of the mix that you're cultivating, or theoretically the oxygen demand could be so great that it outweighs the actual oxygen that you're able to deliver. So it's really important that in order to know that you're producing something that's as effective as it could be, I tend to recommend to people to over-spec the equipment that they use. So put in a really nice meaty air diffuser with as small oxygen bubbles kind of emitted as possible, and a really big chunky pump that can deliver much more oxygen than is ever needed into your container of water. And that container of water with your compost, with your foods, with the oxygen pumping through it, is left to run for, general standard is 24 hours, but it could be as long as 48 hours provided that additional foods are added. And it's allowed to run for a period of time to allow that culturing, the growth of those organisms to occur. And the sweet spot really is that point at which the population concentrations are up there, absolute maximum, having consumed almost all of the food given to them, getting them just before they consume it all, and then taking it and applying it. Obviously, the longer you leave it past that, the more things start to tail off, and it's probably a good idea to ensure that there's a little bit of food left as well to transport them to wherever it is you want to apply them, and ensure that they survive for a little bit of time while they establish around your plants. Now, unfortunately, my little video here doesn't work, but you can kind of get the idea. What we're looking at here is a bit of a blurry image of a diffuser pumping out a super high level of oxygen enriched water. This diffuser is probably about 60-70 centimeters wide, and it fits in a tank that's around 800 liters. You can scale that down to your own size. For most kind of gardens or allotments, around 20 to 30 litre bucket size is normally sufficient to produce a really nice microbially rich concentrate that can be used all over your veggies and fruit and plants and flowers. So yeah, real emphasis on making sure that your oxygen is taken care of by over specifying the equipment that you use. And that's a great way to know that there aren't going to be any problems with the solution going anaerobic at any point during that brewing cycle. If it goes anaerobic, we could start to get organisms that we don't want, anaerobes as opposed to aerobic organisms. So how do you know if you have a useful, good compost tea? Well, it is really, really hard to know without testing. There are, I suppose, some prerequisites that could be put in place that if you adhere to those and follow certain procedures, then generally speaking, you can be assured that there isn't going to be any problem and you will have produced something effective. But even then, I would recommend to most people, if you can, either get a microscope and learn how to use it and look at what you're brewing yourself and just get a measure of how good is it, or speak to a lab and send it off and have it analysed. And if you do that once or twice throughout the growing season, the first time will kind of tell you what you've done is correct and good enough, and then the second time is kind of more of a quality assurance measure later down the line to show that everything is as it should be. But the prerequisites I mentioned are the compost that you're using. And again, you're not going to know that the compost is good enough unless you test it. So either look at it yourself or have it tested by a laboratory. But if you are using a super microbially diverse, concentrated, well-matured compost, then that provides the foundation for a really good brew. And the other is the equipment that you're adding and the method that you're following. I will leave a link for you at the end of the presentation. I'll pass it to you guys so that you can perhaps get in touch. But through Soil Biolab, my laboratory, we've done a lot of trials on compost tea, and we did some work a couple of years back looking at different formulations, and what we kind of produced was a white paper, scientific paper, which looked at the most simple foods that could be used to brew something consistently at a high level. Once you start looking into compost tea, you will find that there are all kinds of things all over the internet, and everyone's using weird and wonderful recipes. But the key things are having foods for bacteria, foods for fungi, continuous oxygen, and an excellent compost. If you follow those kind of prerequisites, you should produce something that is better than just the compost at the start, microbially speaking. If you do get the chance to look at your compost with a microscope, or perhaps even do plate counting, your bacterial concentrations will want to be somewhere in the region of 8 or 9 times 10 or to the power of 10, 8 or 9 to the power of 10 per milliliter of solution as a minimum. The optimum really is to hit the 10 at 10 to the power of organisms per mil of solution. So really quite concentrated. And you would want to have as many different species of bacteria as you can. There's a couple kind of listed for you here, but it's not just about numbers, it's about the diversity as well. And similar situation with fungi. Measured slightly differently in this case, you would want somewhere between 2 and 10 micrograms of active fungi per mil, and 5 to 20 micrograms of total fungi per milliliter of solution at the end. Active bit, remember, they are awake and functioning. Total fungi includes active, but might also include inactive, dormant fungi as well. That's really important to have kind of a total population figure as well, because not all organisms survive in a soil once they've been applied from the outset. There might be certain circumstances, environmental factors or situations which activate them, and then we can cash in on their activity later. So it is still important to have kind of a total figure as well as looking at just the activity levels in your compost tea. So why should you use compost tea when you are growing your own food? Unfortunately, there is not a tremendous amount of robust, peer-reviewed information that exists on the interweb about compost tea. And really there are a couple of key principles that people use it and anecdotally report it to benefit. The first of those is it appears to assist plant growth, but mainly it seems to have a positive effect in terms of disease suppression. And suppression is a key word here. Holds back. It's used, it can, and I've personally seen this on a number of projects that I've been involved in over a number of years. It seems to work best on diseases as a preventative, not as a curative treatment. So you need to kind of be applying it and have conditioned the soil and the plants before there's likely to be a problem. In the case of mildews, for example, that might be later in the season, kind of around summertime, when there might be sort of random rainfalls and humidity increases. But unless you've been applying since kind of the early stages of spring to build that resilience, there's still the possibility that you might have an outbreak of something like mildew. So anyway, disease suppression is one of the reported benefits. And in that regard, especially that assisting plant growth, it could well be a useful tool that underpins a natural food production system or whatever other plants you're growing. So in addition to perhaps your growing method like no-dig or application of compost, compost tea could be a great addition that plugs into that, something in your toolbox that you can do just to give things a bit of a boost, and it's still natural because it's obviously derived from natural materials and the compost. An area where some work is being done, and I'm involved in some other work, which is in its early stages, is looking at the effects of nutrient density of food and soil biological activity. There's a number of organisations in the UK and America who are starting to do this, and been lucky enough to be involved in talks with one of those. But needless to say, the more active your soil is, the more brimming with diverse concentrations of microbes, the easier it should be in theory to release more of the potential of the soil and give more nutrients to the plants that you want to eat. So if you're concerned with producing the healthiest food, again, this could be a great thing to affect what's happening in your soil, and ultimately maybe there's a benefit in terms of nutritional value for your food. Soil biology and nutrient status is often neglected actually when people are growing their own. They might test their soil, although in my experience most people don't. People tend to just assume things, and that could be that they've always done things a certain way, they've always applied a particular compost, and so the organic matter's fine, and therefore the soil biology is fine and it takes care of itself. That isn't always the case. I do recommend to people, if you test it, you can manage it. Once you know, you can do something about it. And again, knowing where your soil microbiology levels are might affect your decision as to if you do want to use an amendment like a compost tea to help charge things in the soil and ultimately give you the best chance of producing the most nutrient rich grow your own food that you can. But why compost tea on any of your food stuffs that you're growing in your allotments? Well, it does seem to make a lot of sense in the absence of hard and fast data, which does seem to be very spread out. I mean, I'm as guilty as others for this. I've been involved in a number of projects over the years, from large arable scale through to effects on soil and trees in mature parklands. The theory does seem to make a lot of sense. It's a sympathetic approach to improving soil that ultimately, if we can improve the soil, will affect the interactions between the plant roots and the organisms and ultimately benefit the vitality of the plant itself. If we can affect the vitality of the plant, it should in theory be more giving to us and provide us even tastier, healthier food as well. So it does seem to make a lot of sense. I suppose at worst it would do nothing, but I know from my own experience that it is possible to multiply organisms through this process, and through years of soil testing I know that it is possible to affect the conditions in the soil and arguably improve them for the positive. And so it really does make sense that if you can improve the condition of the soil, you are giving what you grow the very best chance in life, and then it will reward you. What else can it do, you may ask? Well, here's a few suggestions for you. I've mentioned feeding plants, so the principle there is nutrient cycling. As those organisms consume the soil organic matter, they convert it into elements which your plants take up through their roots. A compost tea might also stimulate root growth, especially if applied early in the season. So it not only contains kind of biochemicals that help feed that early growth of a plant, but also the organisms that it contains that are active will also interact with the roots and might stimulate a little bit of extra growth earlier in the year. And when applied to leaves, really interesting. So you've got the nutritional kind of value, if you like, of the tea itself, which when applied to leaf surfaces, stomatal action, it could actually absorb some of that. So it could be a weak foliar feed, but also it can produce or can help stimulate photosynthesis in plants. So again, applied at the right time of the year, it could really help promote vital growth through stimulating additional photosynthesis if applied as a light mist to the upper and lower leaf surfaces. Also, kind of while we're talking about applying to leaf surfaces, there's some newer research that's kind of come on stream that suggests that applying compost tea to plant leaves can cause reactions with a particular type of family of organisms called endophytes. So these are kind of leaf-dwelling organisms. When stimulated in a particular way, that appears to have a kind of sub-effect of those stimulated endophytes make something happen in the roots of the plant as well. So really exciting area of work, and obviously when you apply things to leaves of plants, often you see the effects a lot quicker than just as a soil drench. And then the last kind of benefit that it might bring here is this idea that it suppresses diseases. When applied to leaf surfaces, again, the principle at play there is that these organisms crowd out the harmful organisms. So you're adding lots of beneficial bacteria and fungi which take up all the little spots on the leaf surface, and it leaves no room for the pathogen, which is why using compost tea as a preventative rather than curative, it seems to have a positive effect, like the mildew analogy I gave you earlier. Also, in terms of kind of literature review and available information, there's a lot more evidence to suggest its benefit for disease suppression than straight nutrient cycling, than the kind of first one here, feeding plants. So definitely worth a go if you can do it earlier in the season and see if it has an effect on any of your crops which are particularly troubled by diseases. So when it comes to applying compost tea, the great thing about it is that the user is fully in control of the whole process. And what that means is most people will produce their own compost themselves, and that takes a degree of experience and skill. To do it properly, there's a meticulous process where it's actively managed. So if you already have that mindset, compost tea becomes a natural extension of that. Also, the equipment that you use, as long as you operate within the tolerances in terms of correct flow rate for oxygen and then water pressure for delivering the microbes to your plants, which is 75 to 100 psi, tends to be the level at which non-excessive damage occurs. If you can do that, then you apply a solution which is effective. And you can build that equipment. You could apply it with a watering can or a backpack sprayer, and so actually you're operating in fairly low pressure tolerances and are not really harming the brew. And with a simple sprayer, yeah, it's possible to produce a lovely fine mist that can cover the greatest area of leaf surfaces possible, and you can actually apply it to a lot of plants as a result. So little goes a long way, and that 20-litre bucket brewer that I suggested earlier, actually you could do a really, have an impact on quite a large area with a relatively small brewer. So it doesn't need to be like the 800 litre brewer and diffuser that I showed you earlier. The other great thing is applications can be carried out for the majority of the growing season. You could even front load and apply more just before things start to grow if you were so inclined. I often tell people, although you're not going to get the absolute most active solution on the ground when it goes to ground, you will be building up those total reserves of bacteria and total reserves of fungi. True, you may lose some if you're applying and it's particularly cold or particularly hot, but at the end you're adding to that reserve, that account of organisms which will be cached in, become alive, become active and contribute to the soil when the conditions are right. So all is not lost, and as a result you can apply these days for a lot higher proportion of the year than perhaps people previously used to consider. We've used compost tea in all sorts of places, as I've mentioned earlier, from field scale, arable, kind of field trial levels through to mature trees in fantastic open parks. And in order to get it in the canopy, we've used telescopic poles such as this. We've also looked at other mechanisms for kind of getting the solution airborne. You can see also, bottom right corner, how we apply it to wood chip mulch as well. Still going through a sprayer, but a much coarser particle size, and it gives you a better coverage quicker where you're trying to soak the ground that it's being applied to. In other parks, we've used that similar pole system, but on tractor drawn Bowser systems as well. So really is flexible. I've already mentioned, you know, for working in allotments or even in a garden, using a watering can with a nice kind of rose attachment on the end can really deliver a compost heap very, very effectively. I don't recommend filtering the solution if you can avoid it when you're going through some of this apparatus. The nozzle head is a crucial component, and actually the particles of compost, if it's not strained or removed correctly, can block those nozzles. But rather than filter through a 150 or 200 micron mesh, which a lot of people like do, I prefer to just siphon off the top of the solution down to the sediment after letting it settle, and that way you remove the majority of the particulates and don't have a problem with any blockages when spraying. Just before I talk about the keys to success, I will touch on one of the questions which I'm asked quite a lot, which is about the balancing of a bacterial brew versus a fungal brew, or fungal dominant compost tea versus a bacterial dominant. And really the answer to that question is how long is a piece of string, which is a bit of a cop-out. But the reason for that is the product that you get at the end, the compost tea that you produce, is a magnification of the compost that you've started with. So if it wasn't there at the start, it's not going to be there at the end, unless of course you add isolated strains of bacteria and fungi to your brew during the brewing process. You can buy powders and things to throw in. But for the most natural brew that I'm talking about here, it's entirely dependent on the properties of that compost you start with. So it is better to use a healthy, mature, well-matured compost that has been left for a good amount of time to build up concentrations of all these bacteria and fungi that we want. If you don't already have your compost heap on soil, I would suggest that you put a proportion of your finished compost onto soil and just leave it, and the soil, out of the soil will come all those microbes that we want, we hope, and increased levels of fungi as well. But by and large, it's not too hard to increase concentrations of bacteria. It is a bit harder to increase fungi, but there are a couple of things that you might want to consider to try and do that. The first is the foods that you apply. So tweaking what foods you apply, or supplying a couple of different types of fungal foods might be a good starting point. The other, and probably the most critical, is increasing the brew time. Bacteria can multiply incredibly quickly. Fungi, it's a much slower process, and we need to allow for that. So that means we might need to apply slightly more fungal foods, or add fungal foods as time goes on, and increase that 24 hours to perhaps 36 or even 48 hours to give the fungi the maximum amount of time we can to build up their reserves before we stop the process and take them away. The final suggestion to try is adding some form of heating to your brew. I'm not talking about heating it up to kind of bath water temperatures. What I mean is just something that helps maintain a steady temperature of around 20-21 degrees can be really useful as well, especially if you're brewing outside and especially at the start of the year. An aquarium kind of heating element is a great choice to use because it's already waterproof and all enclosed, and it's safe, and it switches on and off as needed. A lot of people might frown upon using a heat element. I have used them in the past. They definitely do help increase the concentrations of organisms in a brew. They do help fungi as well when combined with increasing brew time. There is some skepticism though about applying a warm compost tea to a cold soil and the effects that it might have, and I think there probably is some truth to that. However, I do also stand by this kind of mantra that you're better to do something and add what you have produced if it's been produced correctly, if the protocols have been followed, then to not. So ultimately you will be building those reserves to cash in when the time's right. So looking at foods, increasing brew time, and possibly considering adding temperature may help you to produce something that has higher concentrations of fungi. Ultimately though, the approach I take is to try and produce something that is balanced, and if I'm going to produce that much more fungi, I would want to make sure that I've got an equal quantity of bacteria as well, so that I have a kind of microbial soup that's at a 1-to-1 ratio as far as possible. So after that tangent, I'll kind of come back to keys to success, which I've kind of covered throughout the presentation. Cleanliness I haven't, though. Hygiene is absolutely paramount to all of this. It's super important to make sure that all the apparatus you use are super clean and dry after every use. That may mean using a weak chlorine or even a weak kind of watered down bleach solution if needed, just to make sure that biofilms are removed at the end of a brew. Obviously, if you do that, make sure they're allowed to aerate or rinsed off so that you don't have residual traces. But so important to have a completely aerobic environment at all times. The water source is also important as well, and I think in addition to testing your compost and looking at a brew, it's a good idea to look at the quality of the water that you use. So things like the pH straight off of the mains or a borehole could be good, as well as perhaps even the elemental makeup of it as well. If you are taking water straight from the mains, I do suggest that you aerate it or let it sit for a day or so first. If you don't have time to let it aerate or kind of acclimatise for 24 hours, you can run it without the compost and just the diffuser aerating it to gas off chlorine, and I would suggest do that as long as you can, because the chlorine levels differ dependent on where you live. Oxygen demand I mentioned, overspec it, so use a big pump, a big diffuser, as much as possible to make sure there is much more than is needed put into the water at all times. Temperature I've touched on, as I have the brew cycle, and when applying, be as methodical and meticulous as you will have been throughout the rest of the process. So don't do something stupid, just kind of throw it around, treat it with some care and respect, and it will reward you back. So you'll be pleased to know that's the end of the presentation. My summary, which I will just quickly read through the bullets here. The quality of the compost tea relates directly to the quality and characteristics of the compost you use at the start. Most important thing. Regularly test the quality of your brew. So I mentioned ideally start of the season, just to make sure that your procedures are correct, and maybe once or twice more throughout the season if you can, just to validate that everything's going as it should. If you can, invest in a microscope and train yourself to use it. That can save you a lot of money and a lot of heartache, because it can be quite a big time investment to produce compost tea. Developing your own kind of repeatable protocol is a great way to also make sure that you produce something that's the best quality and as effective as it can be. So kind of develop a checklist type system. Correct handling is vital to its effective use, so make sure you do the right things throughout the process, including decanting it and spraying it, to make sure that you don't lose any of that biological activity and reserves of total bacteria and fungi that you want in your soil and on your plants. Hygiene and contamination we've just spoken about. It's just so important to be all over how clean everything is at all stages. It's so much easier to clean everything down instantly after decanting your solution. That means that it's kind of surfaces and residues just come off that much easier, and you can often just use your hand for a large proportion of it without having to use other additives and scrub surfaces which put kind of microscopic scratches in, and those scratches kind of can harbour anaerobic bad microbes later, or you could develop biofilms. So clean as you go at all stages is key. To really be effective, you need to repeat applications throughout the season. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to work in the same way of traditional fertilizers or treatments. You can't really apply it once and just see the effects instantly, unless of course you're very, very lucky. It's all about preventative, building up reserves, conditioning the soil over time. And you know, for those that are skeptical about does it work or not, I'd say, you know, a good starting point is to test your soil before and then test it at the end of a season of applications, and just compare the two and see where things might have changed. You can do that as rigorously or kind of fag packet kind of trial way. You can do it however you want, however you need to validate that for you. But that's a good first step before you move into plant health, vitality and nutrient kind of assessments of what you're growing. Yeah, and then finally, soil and foliar treatments. Generally, it's understood that the benefits fit around this idea of nutrient cycling in the soil, so boosting soil microbes, which in turn devour and convert the soil organic matter and build up resilience to combat disease before it actually occurs. I think we've reached a natural end. We're at the last slide, so it's a good place to stop. Thank you ever so much for listening, and maybe we take this offline now and I will answer some questions. So thank you again. So there we go. That wraps things up. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I would love it if you hit the like, and if you like videos like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.